This show is supported by Odoo. When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.
Of all the ways Albert Einstein's brain amazed the world, one thing really stands out. Upon his death, researchers were given permission to try and work out what made that brain different. But after carefully removing the gray matter from the great mathematician's skull, weighing and measuring and examining the physical structure, what they discovered about Einstein's brain was that it was unremarkable, actually a little smaller than average, although well within the normal range. And viewed under a microscope, Einstein's neurons also offered nothing noteworthy. From KERA in Dallas, this is Think. I'm Chris Boyd. Einstein himself always denied there was anything special about the brain he was born with. He gave credit for his achievements to his unwillingness to let go of hard problems until he solved them and his insatiable curiosity. And my guest believes we can all teach ourselves to think like Einstein about how to achieve great things. Dr. Josh Turknett is a board-certified neurologist and the founder of the Institute for Performance Neurology, where he works at the intersection of neuroscience, learning, and human potential. His new book is called The Genius and the Imposter, the neuroscience of unlocking human potential. Josh, welcome to Think.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You write that we have to let go of what you call the special brain story in order to achieve everything we are capable of. What is that story exactly?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. That's kind of what sets up the whole book. I call it the special brain story, and it's the story that I think most of us inherited at some point in our lives, usually early on. It's also the story that what fueled kind of this search to look for the source of genius in Einstein's brain, right? So the story is that, we're all born with a different brain, right? And we get that at birth, and it's kind of our job to figure out what kind of brain we got. If we get a math brain or a music brain or an art brain, right? And that there's also this, some kind of special quality that we also get this amount of intelligence, this smart juice that we're all born with, and we go to school to figure out how much smart juice we got. And this special brain story is kind of how we frame, geniuses or feats of genius, right? That people who did extraordinary things, like an Albert Einstein, did so because they were born with a special brain, a brain that could do those things, a brain that could do things that most other brains can't do, right? So that it's kind of innate, inherited, and sort of what you're capable of throughout your life is determined by that brain. And then the reason I opened the book with the tale of opening up Einstein's brain, scientists at the time, many still do, kind of think of this as, this is there must be some kind of special hardware in the brain of a genius, right, that powers their abilities. And that's why pathologists were so excited at the time Einstein died. For sure, they were going to find something really spectacular in there that was going to, be, this is what he had, and maybe we can, bottle it or put it in a pill and give it to everybody. And after this extremely exhaustive analysis, probably the most exhaustive pathological analysis of any brain in history, they didn't find anything unique, nothing that would explain, his gifts. And in fact, as I mentioned, and as you mentioned, his brain was actually a little bit smaller than average. And if anything, like they thought, well, surely it's going to be bigger because it's going to have more connections, more neurons, whatever it's going to be. And so everything didn't square with the special brain story. Now, we didn't, after that happened, we didn't exactly stop telling it, right? We just kind of said, oh, well, maybe it's, our microscopes aren't powerful enough, or maybe it's genetics and we just can't see what it is, and so forth. So it was the story was just had too much hold, too seductive, I think, for us to collectively let go of it at that point, even though it was a pretty powerful refutation of it, not in and of itself, but certainly wasn't the evidence that they were looking for, the evidence that you would hope for to align with that story.
Just so everybody's clear, that story is The Imposter. And you say the genius built our capabilities. This is whatever our brains are able to do. The imposter narrates them. Why should the stories we tell ourselves about how our brains work and what they're able to do for us have any bearing on how well we do in life?
Yes. So another great question. It is, I think, hard for us to appreciate the magnitude by which the stories that we tell ourselves, about others, how much those shape the lives that we end up leading. And there are a couple of different ways I think about this. One is just in my own direct experience in working with people, and whether that's as a physician, treating neurological conditions that require some element of behavior change, or whether it's helping people to perform at their best, or to learn a musical instrument. Whatever it is, if the story is blocking that process in some way, the story they're telling, another word for that might be their mindset around it. If that is interfering, then that's sort of a multiply by zero. Nothing's going to follow. Anything that we do beyond that is not going to help unless we get the story right. So part of it's just personal experience, knowing that's the first thing I always address, because I've learned that if I don't, we won't make progress. But we also know the reason why stories can have such an impact is the stories we tell are ultimately a product of our mind, and our mind is our brain, right? So our brain is wired into every bit of us, right? Every bit of us. So even though the things that are going on in our head, the stories that we're telling, they don't feel like they're made of stuff, right? And so that's one of the reasons it's so easy to sort of underappreciate just how powerful they are. But they are a product of stuff, and that stuff is connected to everything. So there's a biological channel for it to impact us. And then we also have research showing how much stories matter. There's the research on the Pygmalion effect, which is when teachers are given an experiment in which they were told certain students had high potential, right? It was just chosen at random. But by the end of the year, they remeasured their IQ scores, and they've gone up. Those children who were told they're high potential, and the opposite studies have also been done, where there's told this particular student doesn't have potential or whatever, and those end up performing worse. So the stories that are being told about them, right? It's not just the ones we tell about ourselves, but the stories we tell about others, which end up becoming their stories, right? The kids inherit that from the behavior of the people around them. And those stories themselves are then shaping, how they interact with the world, what they think they're capable of, what they'll try, what they won't try. So the story we tell ourselves is, arguably it can either be our greatest asset or our biggest enemy. And so it's the place we all start. And I feel, and this book and the special brain story is, to me, we've sort of we have the reverse of the Pygmalion effect, which is called the Gollum effect, right? At civilization scale, we're telling this story about all the limitations that come, when we're born, and that story is limiting potential, not just individually but collectively.
You remind us that the whole evolutionary reason we have brains is to keep us alive, right? So why not hardwire our brains the way, broadly speaking, our kidneys and our hearts are sort of hardwired to do the thing they're good at, and they don't have to keep changing methods over the course of a lifetime?
Yes. So the brain that we have is soft wired, meaning that it is incredibly adaptable. But we traded that adaptability for sort of hardwired instincts. It's the reason we have the longest childhood in the entire animal kingdom, is because we have to spend our entire childhood wiring up our brain. But it's our ability to learn that confers our intelligence, right? That's one of the big points of the book, is that intelligence isn't this special juice we inherited. It is the product of the things that we've learned over the course of our lives. And the advantage of having a soft-wired brain is that it allows us to be incredibly adaptable, right? If you hardwire in your instincts, the advantage of that is you can be an independent animal right out of the gate, right? So, and some animals are. The downside of that is you have to stick to the habitat or the place where your brain evolved and where your instincts were evolved to suit. Whereas if you're a software brain, right, you can move to other habitats and adapt and learn new things and ways to do that. And probably the greatest example of that is our ability to learn language, right? And if the reason that we can learn English or Chinese or Swahili or whatever it is we have is because we have an adaptable software brain that can learn these things. And language and a lot of that softwiring probably was facilitated by the evolution of our ability to learn language, which opened up an entirely new avenue of thinking possibilities for us. That is kind of the signature difference of human brains with other animal brains.
Speaking of language, a lot of us have heard this story that it's incredibly easy for small children, young children, to learn language as long as they're exposed to it. And then it becomes more difficult, sometimes even impossible for people once they've reached a certain age. That turns out not to be true. Why do we believe it? And why does it feel that way, Josh?
Great question. I think it feels like language is harder, and it feels like a lot of things are harder, right, as you get older. And there are great reasons for that, and most of those reasons are not our brain losing something. It's our brain working exactly as it's supposed to work, and we wouldn't, and in ways that if it was doing something different, we wouldn't want that. But for the first part, like you said, there's clear evidence we can learn language at any age. One reason why it's so much harder is if you think about when we're first born, right? We're born in this environment where everywhere we're immersed in that language all the time, right? We are getting, so our genius, our unconscious learning engine that builds all of our skills, right, is surrounded by exactly the kind of data that it needs, right? Our culture is built to help kids learn languages, just automatically. They just plop in, and it's almost the perfect curriculum. So they're getting these inputs every day. They have people around them who are really wanting to help them, right? We have special ways we talk to babies, right? So that we meet them where they are with how we talk to them rather than speaking to them like adults. We're providing input that's perfectly tailored to what I call their Goldilocks zone, right? So where they are, where they need to be, and then we help them move along. And they are driven to learn. They care a ton about learning, right? It is literally a matter of life and death as a child, because learning to communicate is a core human skill that we need to be functioning adults. So you have this great learning environment, this full immersion, and you care a ton about learning it. And that's rarely replicated in any adult who's trying to learn language, right? And then this gets to the broader question of, does it feel like it's harder to learn certain things as an adult? So there's the illusion that the childhood brain is plastic. And I think the bigger picture that the language example speaks to is the fact that once we're adults, we've built the skills that we need, right? And if we want to build something new, we have to figure out a way to signal our brain that we actually need it, right?
You have to want it bad, is what you're saying.
You have to want it bad, right? All these things that we built, we're extraordinary at, right? That we learned to do in childhood, we built because we wanted it bad, right? It was literally a matter of life and death, right? So it's you have to give the brain a reason to care about it, and that's where it starts. So that alone is a barrier, and there are other reasons, but the broadest point being that the capacity to change, the capacity to learn those things, the genius, which is this non-conscious learning engine that magically weaves together neural networks for language and walking and socializing and recognizing faces, it's always with us, right? And we can always activate it at any point in time.
Josh, why is it significant that the thinking skills we humans find most challenging and send ourselves to school for more than a decade are actually the ones that are really easy to give to a computer, whereas teaching computers and robots how to do things like talk and walk and read facial expressions, some of those things still haven't been perfected in lab settings?
Yeah, and I think this gets to how we've collectively underestimated just how extraordinary every single brain is and what every single brain does. Back in the middle 20th century, the computer scientists wanted to work on developing artificial intelligence, and they thought that, okay, if we want to make any traction here, if we want to sort of give proof of concept, let's figure out like what are the easy targets that we can do, and what they did was they kind of introspected and thought, okay, what's easy for us, what's hard for us, right? Well, the hard things, the sort of the on the top of the pedestal, are the thinky things like math and logic and chess, and the easier things are things like walking and talking and vision. So they quickly found, after trying those things, that those were insanely hard. The things that we find easiest were hard, and it ended up that the scale, that it was essentially inverted. That the things that were easiest to program a computer to do were the things that we thought would be the hardest. So things like, we've had calculators for decades, right? Computers could beat our best players at chess by the 90s, right? We have people who lost to a Jeopardy, and we've only just had ones that can artificial intelligence, right? They can understand language. But they require, insane amounts of training data, insane amounts of processing power and energy, like gigantic data centers to power this skill that we all learn as children. And the reason is the complexity of what's happening under the hood in those things is extraordinarily complex. Still don't have robots that can navigate a staircase like a 3-year-old, right? I mean, it's amazing. And our brain builds that from scratch, just based on its ability to recognize and generate patterns, and figure those out in the world to build skills. And so that gave us a window into how extraordinary these things that we all take for granted and thought were easy. And the reason that we think they're easy has to do with how we learn anything. Our conscious mind is slow and can't really keep much. We can keep like 4 items in our mind at one time, right? We can only pay attention to one thing. That if we had to rely on that to do things like walking or talking, which require a gajillion different processes running at the same time, right? If we had nothing, we would never be able to learn anything. We would never be able to grow our cognitive capabilities. So the only way we do it is from transferring things from effortful conscious control to unconscious and automatic and living in these non-conscious systems. The thing is, once that happens, we don't feel it. The cognitive load goes to almost to zero, so we feel like it's easy. So these networks that are running the most powerful computations that we have in our brain feel like they're nothing. And it's when we hit against something that we don't know how to do because we haven't built the skills or the networks for it yet. That's when we feel effort and we feel like it's hard.
You mentioned paying attention a few minutes ago. What does our attention, our curiosity, essentially our taste for learning have to do with the fact that it at least appears that we come into this world wired to be good at different things?
Yeah. So one thing that I think that causes us to think that there are sort of innate talents or aptitudes is that most of the learning that our brain does happens without anybody noticing, right? Including the person doing the learning, right? And it's driven by attention. It's driven by curiosity, right? Curiosity is what opens the channel for our brains to learn something. It starts, that sends the cue that says, hey, this is something that's important, right? The things that we pay attention to, the things that we care about are sending the signal to the brain to say, oh, this is something that's important. We need to change our brain to figure out, change our connections to figure out how to do this thing, right? So everything starts with curiosity, and then so once you have that mechanism in place, very early differences in what brains are paying attention to, right, can create significant significant trajectories. So that by the time they're 3, one kid has been paying attention to music for 3 years, right, and another kid has been paying attention to paintings or whatever, nature, and those can then look like innate differences, right? Because they've been building these structures in their mind for those particular domains. It would be like, imagine we see this with language, right? And we don't think anything of it. A child just, around the ages of, 12 months, 18 months, starts just producing words, right? As if from nowhere. We didn't show them how to do that, right? We didn't teach them that. And they can start comprehending, like, incredibly, and it just explodes. And at some point they're talking, right? But they're talking in the language that's been around them, right? Like if it's English, it's English. If it's Chinese, it's Chinese. We don't ever say, oh, they must have an aptitude for English, right? It was because they were paying attention to English for all that time, that's where they built that extraordinary capability. And we see that in other domains, and we think, oh, it must have been an innate aptitude, when really it's a function of where we've been placing our attention, where our curiosity has been. That's what our brain trains on. That's the patterns our brain figures out, and then that creates these differences that may look like they were born or innate, but they're learned.
So what does that tell you about the best way to do formal education? If we agree as a society that we probably all need to learn some things that we're not innately that curious about but are important, how can we do school better?
Great question. It is challenging to learn anything for real, to consolidate over the long term anything that we're initially driven by curiosity to learn. If we all think about the things that were taught to us in school and what we still remember, it's likely a very, very tiny fraction, right? And most of the things that we now have in our, the capabilities that we have, we can reflect back and think those were driven by the things that we were interested in, the things we cared about getting good at, right? The things that I do every day that were not acquired in school, they're acquired by me learning about the things that I was really interested in. But like you say, there are still things that we think are important for all children to learn. Learning how to read is one of them, right? So the question is, how can we do education better as a whole? And the challenge right now is that most of learning is not curiosity driven, and that to compensate for that, we drive it with rewards and things to signal achievement. So external motivation, when we know that rarely leads to long-term consolidation of memory and long-term skill acquisition. So getting away from changing from the model, from an achievement-driven model to a learning for the sake of learning model, making it more applicable to an individual child, and then meeting each child where they are. Now, that's a challenge for a public school system or formal schooling where you have one teacher and 20 kids or more, right? But we know that the best learning happens if it's one-on-one and it's tailored to that particular child's where they are and where they need to be, and every child is different on that axis, right? So how do you solve that problem? There was a paper in the early 80s by Benjamin Bloom who showed that he divided kids into three groups. One group had just traditional classroom schooling. One group had one-on-one tutoring, where they were, the materials they were getting was constantly being tailored to where they were, frequent assessments to figure out what they needed to do next. And the ones who got one-on-one tutoring ended up in the 98th percentile compared to the other children. So we know that tailoring, your instruction to the needs of a particular child is the goal. That's the goal. That's the holy grail. And he referred to that back then as the 2 sigma problem, meaning that you can get children to go 2 standard deviations from where they are with one-on-one. And it was the challenge he threw at the time was, how can we do this at scale? And that's still an open question. I think there's hope that part of the solution to that could be through AI in helping to craft curriculum and assessments that are tailored to where a child is. What we know from the education literature, from understanding how the brain works, that what we need are frequent low stakes assessments to know where a child is at, what they need next. What we get right now are infrequent high stakes assessments that aren't really oriented around feedback, but oriented around measurement.
Tests.
So tests, exactly, which is just how that goes back to the special brain story, right? It's this idea that a test is where are you at, not what do you need, right? And those need to be much more frequent than they are, and have much lower stakes, where it's simply about figuring out where you are, not a verdict on on you, right?
So we just talked about tests. A few minutes ago, you mentioned standard deviations. This makes me think about IQ assessments. I am well aware of the criticism around IQ and, concerns that it's an inaccurate measurement. But we do know that people given IQ tests will get different scores. So what is an IQ test measuring?
Good question. So I'll say that an IQ test, interestingly, the original test was designed to try to identify, it was by Alfred Binet, who was in France. The French government had assigned him, he was a psychologist, the task of designing a test to help identify the kids who needed help to get ready for school. So it was initially a school readiness type of a test, and baked into that was this idea that it was supposed to find the kids who needed help so that you could help them get to another point, right? It was, and then it got transformed into being a test of aptitude and this idea that it was fixed, right? And that happened when it came over to the U.S. and another psychologist, Stanley Terman, turned it into kind of that version with the idea of wanting to rank minds and so forth, and all the baggage that comes with that. But ultimately, the way I would frame what IQ is measuring is sort of our resources for cognition, and I think still baked into that to this day is whether or not you currently have sort of traits and capabilities that will predict that you to do well in school as it's currently designed. So it's sort of like a fitness, how fit your brain is at this point in time for school, right? Rather than a fixed assessment of how much smart juice you got, which is what most people still think of it as, right? And of course, if you view it as a fixed factor, and it's designed to predict how you'll do in school, then of course, if the kids who score lower, are not given resources, right, to if we think it's fixed, we think there's something you can do about it, they're going to do less well in school, and then it's going to predict all sorts of other things that are associated with not doing as well in school, right? So it has this predictive value, but the very reason it has predictive value in that sense is simply because we view it as some kind of fixed factor, and that it's aligned with one educational method, right? Whereas what I would preferably do is figure out how to meet every child and figure out the methods that works best for them. And that gets back to our question of education and how to best address it. Is that the issue right now is that we have a system that can work to the children who are lucky enough to be in kind of the zone that a one size fits all approach fits, and then it kind of leaves behind the ones that don't.
So Josh, I am following you that we're all born with quite similar brains and similar capacity to learn, that we follow our interests and then we get better and better at the things that we pay attention to and that we really want. How does it happen that people raised in very similar environments, even identical twins, one might want to be a dentist and another might want to be a fashion designer?
Yeah, great question. I think it that alone speaks to the power that the fact that genes are not our destiny, right? That what we've decided to pay attention to and care about, as I talked about earlier, those are the things that drive what kind of skills our brains build, and based on the way we understand the brain, if you have very early differences in what you care about, that can cause it can lead to very different trajectories. And so and that gets to one of kind of what I think of as the overarching objective here, of sort of giving people this renewed understanding of what they're capable of, which is that the goal is not to be Einstein. The goal is not to be someone else. The goal is to be the best version, or the version of you that you want to be, right? And that you have that your potential is limitless. It is your own. Once you are on a trajectory, as the identical twins illustrate, once you are on your own trajectory, that is your trajectory, right? And as you know, and that twin can't do the thing the other twin does because they've already been on different paths, right? And that path then determines kind of the scope of where you can go. It determines your Goldilocks zone, right? And so you can't be Einstein, but you can be an extraordinary version of you and a brain that can do just as extraordinary things as his, right? So all of us right now, we have a particular configuration in our brain of connections and synapses and everything that are the sum total of all the experiences and learning that we've had in our life, right? And that comes with it certain abilities, problems we can solve, a whole collection of things that are only ours.
I don't know if you think back to medical school, Josh, if I'm going to assume, I don't know this for sure, that you wanted to do medicine and you got interested in neurology and that determined your path. I'm also going to assume you had a classmate or two who was pressured to go to medical school because it's a good job, because it's thought to be lucrative, because you'll always be employed. What about people who are sort of forced into something that doesn't necessarily match their natural interests? Can they get there if they work hard enough?
Great question. Yeah, I think that you're right. I did go to medical school largely because I was interested in the brain, and I decided that was the path for me. That was be the best way to harness my interest. And yeah, we make decisions, right, about our life at a pretty young age. I mean, most of the people going into medical school, right, we're in our early 20s, barely adults, and you're choosing this path that for most people means that's what you're going to be doing day in and day out for the rest of your life. It's the doctor, right? So what happens? Yeah, if you choose a particular path and then you realize that's not right, that's not the one for me. I in some ways that's my personal story because I was about 15 years into it and decided that I kind of wanted to change, and no longer was going to do the traditional practice. And I started a company around teaching people to play music, and that was growing. And so, but by the same token, it was, I had this career in medicine, and I think this is stable, and this is, why would I leave that? There's also the sunk cost where right. You think, oh, I did all this stuff. I better, I'm throwing that all away. Right. So I do think a lot of people persist just for those reasons. Right. But I think that another one is that the belief that, I've learned what I'm going to learn. My brain's where it is. So what if I'm going to do something else? It has to be something that I've already acquired, right? I can't acquire something new. And of course that's why I think it's so important to realize that we can, learn anything at any age, especially if we're driven to. I think curiosity, if that's the voice that's coming from it, then that's what's going to build it. If that's what's motivating you, rather than money or status or wealth or whatever.
Some people stand out to us as being just really exceptionally curious. Maybe Einstein was one of those people. He certainly thought he was. Is there natural variation in how curious we are, how driven we are to pursue learning for its own sake? I think so. As far as I know, there's not. I think, and even if there is, I think the far greater reason why we see variability in curiosity, especially as people get older, is whether it gets shut off or not, and sort of the patterns of living and our expectations. Every child starts out insanely. We are all insanely curious, for the first part of our life, and a lot of what happens to that has to do with our early life experiences. And I think in particular, how we end up framing the learning process, right?
So if learning starts to becoming something we do for a goal, right? Whether it's a goal of getting a good grade, whether it's the goal of getting into college, whether it's whatever, where it's not, the goal is not to learn to get better at this one thing, right? It's being driven. So we change our relationship to learning, which was initially this curiosity-driven thing that we all had, and we kind of lose that, and then I think it gets buried and hidden and suppressed, and that's kind of the whole arc of the book in some ways, that as we get older, the part of our brain that's worried about our status and that's worried about where we achievement and where we rank and so forth gets louder and louder, and the part of our brain that built all the extraordinary things we can do, that still can, gets kind of silenced and suppressed by that voice. So we leave the proportion of our life that's led by the genius shrinks, which is the part that's led by curiosity. And the whole book is trying to help people get that back, restore that balance in the other direction.
You think it is no coincidence that a number of legendary geniuses, I think Da Vinci and Dickens and Darwin, love to take long walks. What is the possible value of stepping away from the writing desk or the canvas or the lab and going on a stroll?
I think the biggest overarching point to understand with that, why would a walk be helpful? And you're right that all the people we revere as great minds, great thinkers, and so forth, so many of them went for walks. They weren't sitting at a desk, multiple hours a day. They understood that all these other things, walking or going out in nature, or or taking a vacation or whatever, that all of these things they weren't taking a break. They were necessary. They were when the mind is doing its best work, right? So if you can kind of think of it as a two-phase process, the time when you're sitting down to learn something, you're trying to sort of feed the genius, you're trying to acquire new capability, build new networks and so forth. But when you are in that particular mode, your brain is in a specific mode of operation, right? We're not just one configuration all the time. Our brain is constantly shifting through different modes. Sleep and wakefulness being the most obvious examples, right? We're very different creatures when we're sleeping, right? We can think different thoughts. We see different things, right? But that is a continuum that continues throughout the day. So the brain that you have when you're walking is not the same brain you have when you're sitting at a desk. And so you're opening up pathways between networks that can talk to each other that don't normally talk to each other when you are in kind of focused mode. And so many, the sort of hallmark of creativity, of novel problem solving, of imagination, new ideas, is when you're making connections between things that seem distant, right? And that only happens when your brain is sort of in these different states. And walking is a great one, where you're sort of these states where your brain is doing some kind of automated motor activity seem to be really good for facilitating that kind of cross network conversations that are happening non-consciously. And that's what generates the aha moments. What you can do at any point in time is only a fraction of what you're capable of doing, right? You have, and so, what you're capable of doing is changing throughout the day. And there may be things, think that you're capable of that you don't even realize they haven't surfaced for decades or perhaps your entire life.
It doesn't speak well of companies that now have the technology that allow them to make sure that people are doing a keystroke every, number of seconds, or, really people feel very surveilled at work, including work that, comes from their brain and maybe through a keyboard. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think I put this, this is one of, I think it's in the Imposter's Playbook chapter. It's the third technique in the playbook, which is the productivity myth, which is the idea that we can only be productive if we're sitting down and working on a task, right? And which, hopefully the book dispels, and that's part of the reason is that we think that the only good stuff happens when we're sitting down and focused, right? But we, as I just talked about, so much as it happens from when we're not doing that. Once you understand that our intelligence is housed in all these non-conscious circuits, that, so much of what we want to be doing is coming from those, and not when we're sitting down in this focus mode, producing work. There's a need for that. But if I think one analogy is like an assembly line. You can only make what's on the assembly line. It's right. It's the non-conscious processing that actually puts the items there. What you can make, and then you go to sort of do your task and make it. If the line's empty, no amount of grinding your teeth and pushing harder is going to make it happen, because you have to fill the line with something, and that's where all this stuff that's not at the desk is making that happen.
How do you, as a neuroscientist, account for savant skills? People are probably most familiar with the character of Raymond from Rain Man, the movie about 30 years ago. But there are a tiny fraction of people that can do things that even Einstein might have found astonishing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I talk about in the book a patient of mine that I had, that I referred to as James there, but James had come in with this neurodegenerative problem. His wife had brought him in and was suffering from something called frontotemporal dementia. But what his wife had also noted was that he was suddenly drawing, and he was creating these incredibly detailed and realistic looking drawings. He'd been a car salesman, never drawn before, and if he'd been asked to, would not even want to, would draw a stick figure or whatever. But now he was drawing these, stuff that looked like a seasoned artist, despite having no prior experience or interest. And this was happening in the context of a neurodegenerative disease. So he was also losing frontal lobe function, and the main function of our frontal lobes or one of the main functions, is to inhibit or suppress activity that we don't want to happen. So he was becoming impulsive. He was doing things in public that he shouldn't do. We have a whole host of reflexes that we're born with. So like if you put your finger in a baby's hand, it'll grasp the hand reflexively, right? Well, what happens with these frontal lobe conditions is that all of these things that the brain is typically suppressing with the frontal lobe come out. And so we refer to this as disinhibition. So he had the grasp response. So if I put a finger in his hand, he would grasp it. But he's also creating these incredible drawings, right? Which is really paradoxical, right? When you think about it, right? In terms of how we think about ability and so forth, is that how could he be gaining this remarkable new capability, right? In the context of a condition that was causing deterioration of his brain. Right, and the reason there is that the most parsimonious explanation there is that an area that could do this was being disinhibited. Right, there's a part of the brain that could see the world in this way, right, to make in a way that would make drawings of this realistic, same kind that we see with congenital savants. So people who start with these abilities early on. The reason was that area of the brain that could do that was being released from suppression, was being disinhibited in the same way that the grasp response, right? And so this is a phenomenon known as acquired savant syndrome, where it happens later in life and always in the context of some kind of injury to the brain or degeneration in this case. And the frontal lobe dementias are where we see it. And probably not coincidentally, the area of the brain that's usually hit in these is the area that's involved with language, and what I refer to as symbolic cognition. And when you see it on the congenital side as well, it's typically in children who have trouble with symbolic cognition. So that's those same networks that are enabling these extraordinary ability for language communication, which is our symbolic thinking. What those appear to be sitting kind of a layer on top of our perceptions that have more direct contact with the world, right? Getting back to the core premise, the special brain theory, a brain is a brain. And what we see in different brains are different expressions, right? So in some brains, all that activity is being suppressed and never reaching conscious awareness. So you don't have any of those savant-like abilities. But if they are, then you do. And it gives us a window. When we see them, we say, well, this is extraordinary. How is it possible that a brain can do that, right? The gifts of memory, that people have, or ability to calculate, the various savant gifts seem like magic to us. But what they're giving us is as a new way, I think, to appreciate just how extraordinary what's happening under the hood is in all of us. And it illustrates the fact that we can have capabilities that may never surface in our entire life, right? And that what we're capable of at any given moment is this product of how our brain is configured, what networks are being suppressed, ones that are active, which ones are active, and that expressing those, what you're capable of is not just a function of learning, but about the different modes that your brain is being put in throughout your day, throughout your life.
Dr. Josh Turknet is a board-certified neurologist, founder of the Institute for Performance Neurology, and author of The Genius and the Imposter, The Neuroscience of Unlocking Human Potential. Josh, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
Think is distributed by PRX, the Public Radio Exchange. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, anywhere you get podcasts, and at think.kera.org. Again, I'm Chris Boyd. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.